Thank you very much for coming. My name is Sruti Rupa. I live in the States, and I first started serving Srila Prabhupada here in Vrindavan in 1975. It's a little high, no? It's good. So my hope this evening is to share with you something that was given to me that would maybe inspire you and show you how Prabhupada is accessible today. He's alive in our lives today. And that if we keep his instructions and his example, his words in front of us and not a historical figure behind us, then we'll be able to understand how he's accessible in everyone, for everyone. So I kind of go all over. I wanted to bring, of course, so I was one of Prabhupada's many cooks, and I began, I got a taste very early on when I was a new devotee, and then that desire stayed with me for 2 years before I got to be in his service. But I believe in intense prayer and desire, and it took about 2 years, but I wouldn't give up. Determination and very eager. I don't want you to think that there were special ones, special devotees that got special mercy. Prabhupada's mercy is actually equal to everyone. And we were fortunate, but we weren't special. And Prabhupada could only give to a certain amount at a certain time, and it was our job then to give to others. And that's what I'm trying to do now, because I feel it is a duty. I'm not one to speak publicly, but I'm feeling as I get older and I'm seeing the eagerness in the new generations to hear about Prabhupada, and I don't want it to be lost. Prabhupada's example, Prabhupada's instructions, Prabhupada's words. And I also want to give a side of Prabhupada. We all know him as Acharya, as Guru. He's the author of all our books that we read. But there's a personal side, and he had a great sense of humor. He cared for us very deeply. He watched over us, and I want to share some of that with you also. So, as far as in the kitchen, and that's something people don't talk about, so I wanted to show that side. I mean, we hear so many things, but we don't hear about Prabhupada in the kitchen, or maybe from the angle of vision from one of his cooks. And there were some very basic principles that I learned and took away with that Prabhupada taught and even demanded if you were going to be in his service. And the 4 principles that I walked away with that have actually don't only pertain to being in the kitchen, but in everyday life and in deepening my Krishna consciousness. And I'm hoping that I can share that with you and make it relevant for you. So these are not just my stories, but these are mine to give to you, because they're also for you. And the first of these principles, I'll just tell you the 4 first, is time, punctuality, same. Waste, Prabhupada hated waste. And quality, purity, cleanliness. So these things may sound like from the kitchen, but they're for in every aspect of our life. And Prabhupada was very expert in utilizing time. Prabhupada never wasted time. He saw Krishna as time. And I have a story in that very simple moment of time, he taught me the principle of time and how to view it and how to see it, how to use it, and how not to waste it. And I'm going to jump from different years according to principle. We're not talking details here, we're going to really just speak principles. So this story on time, because it was so amazing. I mean, Prabhupada's life worked like clockwork. I used to compare it to like a Swiss watch. And the reason Prabhupada liked to keep his servants with him, because if they didn't stay or if they had to leave, it disturbed his service, which was his time. And that means you'd have to train him, things would go wrong, things would mess up, he would be distressed, he would actually get sick if people didn't cook properly. So keeping consistency was very important. And this story about time was actually in 1977 in Calcutta. And Adhari, there you are.
I was thinking it was 5:30.
You thought it was 5:30. Well, I'm going to make you sing at the end. Okay? Well, I will ask you to sing. I'm not going to make you.
Sorry.
I will be. It's our fortune. If you haven't heard Badahari sing, he will help take you to the next place here. So maybe it's just the appropriate time. So as far as time goes, he thought it was 5:30. Many people thought it was 5:30. So we'll still probably see people coming in at 5:30. I was also confused. Yes, Prabhupada, we were talking about time, Badahari, how Prabhupada saw time, didn't waste time, utilized time, and time was very important to him because he saw Krishna as time. But at any rate, this story, we had just left Mayapur. It was actually Prabhupada's last time in Mayapur. It was 1977. And we drove, I think that's what, a 3-hour drive, I can't even remember now, a few hours, and we stopped in the mangrove grove to eat. There's a mangrove grove in between Calcutta and Mayapur, which I understand is no longer there, but Prabhupada always used it as a halfway point where he would take breakfast or take lunch. So we stopped and had breakfast there, and then as soon as we arrived at Calcutta, he went to his rooms and I went straight to the kitchen. So Prabhupada said lunch at 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock meant 1 o'clock. Didn't mean 2 minutes after, 5 minutes after, 1 minute till, it meant 1 o'clock. So, I mean, everything in India at that time was a great austerity, honestly. The kitchen in Calcutta, I don't know if any of you have ever visited 3 Albert Road, but the kitchen was the size of a postage stamp. I mean, I could turn and fall out one of the doors. And they had these, there weren't windows, there was these openings on 2 sides. And literally, if you slipped, you'd be out. So, and there was always some kind of ghee or something on the floor. So it was a challenge to be in there. And in those days, we didn't just turn on a stove and everything worked. We had to create coal buckets. It was like a steel pail, a cow bucket. Cut a hole, you put coals in it, and you would fan it and light it. So we had 2 of those going, using another one for chapatis. So I raced in there, chop, cleaning, get the stoves going, and got everything. And it was 1 o'clock. Plate was made, and I started to walk to his room out on the veranda. And if you've been there, there's these tall, I would say British colonial doors. They must have been maybe 11 feet or something. So open these big, heavy doors. Prabhupada was sitting where he would eat. He was sitting right there against the wall. The doors were here. So when I opened the doors, he was simply staring at the door. He was looking at the door, very serious. The door opened. He looked at me and he said, "You are 3 days late." I didn't say a word. I just put the plate down. And then he went on to say, "Don't you know when appetite comes, if you do not eat immediately, disease will follow?" I didn't say a word, but I made a mental note. I kept this mental notebook, always. And whatever he said, or I would hear him instructing somebody else, I always made a mental note. So again, that was about time. He was there, I was wasting his time. You know, it honestly couldn't have been more than 2 minutes. I'd give it 3 minutes max, but it was, and at that point, he was disturbed. Because time for him was Krishna. And so honestly, in that single moment, he taught me one of the most important principles. And that was punctuality, time, and how to view time, how to see time. And through this principle, he taught me that I'm a servant and that I'm fully obligated to be precise and be expert in the service of my spiritual master. He required this. He demanded it. And if you couldn't keep up with that, you wouldn't last. You wouldn't last. And he was gentle, and he was very gentle with some people, and some people he was not. It was all to the degree which you could handle. And Jamuna would say he treated so-and-so with kid gloves. And he treated her basically, he didn't let her get away with anything. So I would say he was very kind with me, but he still would instruct firmly, and I wouldn't give an excuse. I wouldn't say, but I made sure I never did it again. And on that principle alone, and also just another anecdote, Prabhupada would say to different devotees at different time, when one is accomplished in one thing, they generally become accomplished expert in other things. So he required that we excel. And so then he said, I didn't finish what he said. He said, so when one is accomplished in one thing, they generally like to become expert in many things. He said, now you become expert in devotional service. So that's what he was pushing for. And by his example, by his instructions, and to be in Prabhupada's service, to see the living Bhagavad, he was the principle, he was the theory, he was the heart. He showed us, he cared, he showed us by example, and he wanted us to become expert, but most of all, he wanted us to become expert in devotional service. But as far as being in his service, he demanded that level of expertise, because if you weren't, then you would interfere with his service. And this became very, very much in everyone's mind who was there. And if you got laxed or you got familiar, you were gone. So I tried very hard to maintain that principle. So that was one of the principles that I took away with, was time. Again, I said then waste, purity, quality. These were kitchen principles that he taught, but these were also everyday principles. I spoke about it hard before you came in. There was 4 things that I took away with that was not only in the kitchen, but that I could use in deepening my own Krishna consciousness, and that was time, quality, purity, cleanliness, and waste. He didn't like waste. So just on that, I'm just now still learning after so many years, but it's a conscious thing that I try to do, and I think it's important for all of us, because we do live by rules, regulations, and principles, and time is very important. So the next thing, let me see if I had something else on time. Oh, there's just a little example of how time was important. It was here in Vrindavan in 1975. I was actually, at that time, I was under Daivi Shakti. She was turning over to me Prabhupada's service. And so I started with his breakfast. I started with cleaning his rooms, his breakfast, and then his dinner. And he, all out here, you can't see here, but on that side, he had a full tulsi garden. He had 100 tulsis. So I used to take care of his tulsis, his rooms, his clothes, and then the breakfast and the dinner, and she did the lunch. And just to show you how timing was, I would go to Mangalarti maybe for 10, 12 minutes. And then this was 1975, I came for 4 months of Chaturmas. And so I was living here in the guest house, and it was very hot. It was summer, I was 120. It was not like today. I remember going to sleep with, I'd wet myself totally down, hair, clothes, gum shut, wet this mattress, get under, then keep another full bucket next to me, get under the fan, go to sleep, wake up, just pick up the bucket, empty it over me, and go back to sleep. I mean, it was kind of the way you lived, survived here. And at any rate, that's a side note. But as far as the time, so I would come in, I would go to Mangal Artik for a few minutes, and then immediately slip into his room, I'd come through this door, and he would either be translating in this room, or he'd be taking a nap, and he'd be laid on the gutty there with his head on the bolster, or he'd be sitting there translating. And I would just pay obeisance and go straight back through the servant's room into that back bedroom to his bathroom, because I knew once he got up, he would immediately go to his bathroom. So it was planned out. So I'd do the bathroom, and then that was also a bedroom. Depending on the time of the year, he would sleep there, or upstairs, or even out on the roof. So I'd do the bathroom, then there, and then by that time, Prabhupada would be ready for his walk, and he'd go in, and I was always a seeker for nectar. I always was thinking, planning, trying to figure out how I could get some mercy. I was told I was very bold in my approach, but being a woman in those days, I don't think if you were, you'd get entrance to be near Prabhupada, so I kind of fought with the best of them. And so watching his routine each morning, and I'd see him slip on his shoes, I thought, I'm going to put his shoes on him tomorrow. So he'd come out of the bathroom, and then I'd be waiting there in the servants' quarters, and I would be standing in front of him and put his shoes on. He always just had his head up, received, and put them on, and then he would just literally glide, float off and go. Okay, so then he would go for his walk, and then from the walk he'd go straight into the temple room and be the greeting of the deities in class. So my point being here, I do have the point after all this, is the timing. And it was so well tuned, and Prabhupada was so fixed with his schedule that I couldn't hear. We didn't have microphones, we didn't have speakers. I couldn't hear the class from in his kitchen here. But when that bell rang, I knew Prabhupada was afoot. So when that bell rang, I sped things up. I knew what I had to do. I knew how many minutes, down to the second, what I had at my hand. And this is no exaggeration. So when that bell rang, I could literally count in my mind. So then he would come in here, go through that room, and that room there, where there's a museum-like, was where he ate. It was timed so perfectly. Prabhupada would have one foot on the cushion, the other foot in front, and as he was going down to sit into cross-legged, that plate was just touching the table. It was like it just came in for a landing. And that's the way it was supposed to be. He was never sitting there waiting. That time in Calcutta was a one-off. That never happened again. So that's the way you were trained. And so this built on layers and layers of what being conscious meant. And Prabhupada said, you can't be Krishna conscious if you're not conscious. So becoming conscious is the first step in being Krishna conscious. So that was how that's what Prabhupada expected out of us in terms of time. So the next thing I have here then to share with you is waste. He didn't like waste on anything. And how Prabhupada saw everything, he saw Krishna in everything. One example of a story was here in Vrindavan, 1975, when I was doing the rooms cleaning. So then after I finished the breakfast, he would go into his front room, and then he would meet with devotees and with his secretary, and they would read letters, and he would dictate and so on like that. And so I finished the cleaning, then I'd go to his prasadam room, and then I'd make my way upstairs But when he went on his walk, I cleaned that front room. I had a system. So then I'd end up upstairs. So the last thing was that bedroom upstairs. So that one morning, I decided to leave the fan on so the floor would dry, because I just mopped it. And of course, everything's done by hand. You're down, I had the squat down really well. I could walk, squat, and mop at the same time. It was, it's an interesting way of going about it. So had it all mopped out and thought I'd turn the fan on to dry up the floor. And then I came back downstairs, and on this one day, he went up there, which was unusual because he didn't go at that time of day, but he went up there, and he saw the fan, and he came back downstairs and came to the kitchen and found Devi Shakti and I. And he just said, come with me. Didn't say a word. The three of us walked up the stairs. He opened the door to his bedroom. He looked at us both and he said, fan is on? No one is here? Who is wasting Krishna's energy? That was another click. To that principle today, I walk around in the dark at home. I get guilty if I've left something on, I come back and turn it off. I'm always switching lights, fans, simply because of that one time when he said, who is wasting Krishna's energy? So again, these principles, even though I learned them in the kitchen and in the service of just cleaning a floor, it builds on the principle of seeing Krishna in everything. And this is what Prabhupada was teaching us. Again, and this was 1977. No, it was 1976. Fall of 76. Prabhupada came into his kitchen here. It was Vrindavan. I had been here for a few months earlier, and just giving you a little background before the story. Palika and I were cooking together. Arundhati was here doing the typing, transcribing. Her husband Pradumna was doing, working with Prabhupada, with the translation in Sanskrit. And servant that time was Harisari. So Jamuna had come, and she wanted to get Prabhupada's blessings for writing her cookbook, Lord Krishna's Cuisine. She stayed for a few days, and they would sit in the garden. Prabhupada enjoyed so much speaking to her. It was actually, so that was 76. Yeah, he'd seen her, okay. So they would speak about it, and he gave her the blessings on it, and she wanted to go to Calcutta and connect with Pishima, his sister, and a few others. So it was decided, Prabhupada decided that I should go with her and Palika should go with her to Calcutta to help her research for what she was going to do in the book. So at that point, Arundhati had to take over the cooking. So while we were gone, Prabhupada taught Arundhati. He taught from his desk. He hadn't come in to the kitchen at that point. He taught her how to make this, I think it was called Bhatti Chachari. If any of you are familiar. It was either Bhatti Chachari or Punjabi Bhatti Sabji, both of them. It was a certain way to cook it. So we were over in Calcutta side for a few weeks, and then Palika and I returned. Jamuna went on to America. So the Palika and I took over the cooking again, and he kept asking for this preparation every day, and Arundhati had told us how to make it, and it just wasn't to his satisfaction. So he said, I'll come in the kitchen tomorrow and show you. So I remember very clearly, so it was right after his massage. Everything again was by time. He did this at this time, this at that time, and then after he did the letters and meeting with the secretary, then he took his massage. It was about 11. And he came in the kitchen before he was going into the shower. So he had his gamsha on and he was glistening golden from his massage. And he got to the door And he peeked his head in, and looked in, and he goes, "I've never been in my kitchen before." He said, "It is very nice." And then he stepped in, and the first thing he did was turn to, so it was set up as it is now. If you've been in there, you can see cooking areas here, the wash up, with some storage, and then here is where I would do the cut up and preparation. So I had a steel bucket that I would cut and chop and put that in there and basically throw it to the cows, and so they would eat what we weren't using. And so this topic here, the principle here we're talking about is waste. Prabhupada immediately hadn't been 2 steps in the door, and he looked down and saw I had taken a cauliflower, and you know how it has the leaves over it, and then there's that core. So I pulled back the leaves and I cut around and I took that core out. For me, it was, how was I going to use that? I was only going to use the flowers. First thing he looked, he said, "Why you've thrown this away?" Of course, I didn't say anything. I was just ignorant. I don't know. Wouldn't even know what to do with it. So, but I made a mental note, put it in my notebook, and then I started observing. And when I saw the Indians cooking, they would cut the leaves, throw it in dal, they'd cut that core, throw it in a sabji, cut that core, throw it in a dal. Nothing was wasted. Nothing. So, but a departure here from waste, because this is such a wonderful story. So Prabhupada went, we had a little seat for him there in the kitchen, and so it was Palika, myself, Harsari came, and then one of Prabhupada's dear friends, Bhagaji, Vishwambar Dayal. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Bhagaji, but he would come and meet with Prabhupada every single day, and they would talk. But he also liked making Prabhupada chapatis, and so he would come a lot of the time, and when we were cooking, he would take the chapatis in. But usually when Prabhupada ate, 99.99% of the time, Prabhupada ate alone. He ate in silence. And I wouldn't describe it as he ate. He relished. Prabhupada relished. And it would take him up to 45 minutes to finish his meal. Sometimes you would come in and his eyes would be closed. And he would be eating. And it was really something to witness. Stepping into Prabhupada's room, stepping into his quarters, stepping into his personal space, it was a feeling that a veil was being lifted, and you were able to enter in to the side of the spiritual world, the spiritual person who was here before us by some great fortune. So there was always this alternate universe as you were anywhere around Prabhupada or in his space. So, but the prasadam time was extremely special, and he didn't have visitors, and if someone come, he would take something off his plate and give them, and so they could go. But he wouldn't be rude. He would give you a little something, but it was usually off limits unless some person had arrived or something. So yeah, that was a departure on that, just how Prabhupada ate. I wouldn't describe it as eating. And even with each handful, it was like with a mudra, the way he would eat, the way he would pick up something, and the way he would put it in his mouth. Everything was beautiful. It was, as I said, there was a type of veil that was removed, and to observe this person, I mean, he was a Vaikuntha man. He wasn't of this world, even in the simplest task of eating. So at any rate, this day, he came in, and we had the seat there. We had everything cut up, all the spices that he required. Everything was ground to a paste. It was a paste masala. We weren't using seeds at that time because, again, that was the next point of purity. He wanted everything pure. So everything was there. He sat down. Bhagaji was over here. Palika and I flanked him and was assisting him with the stove. And he put in, and Prabhupada, from what I understand, Bengalis cook on a very high flame. Prabhupada cooked on a very high flame. We weren't used to that. And so he put the flame up and he put the things in and he started chatting with Bhagavad in Hindi. And they were going back and forth, back and forth. And Palika was watching and she got a little nervous and so she turned the flame down. And Prabhupada was chatting and then he went back to it and he noticed and he turned the flame back up. And he kept chatting with Bhagavad. And then he chatted for a minute or two and Palika got worried and she turned it down a second time. And he was talking and then he went back to it and he noticed and he turned it back up. A third time, she did this. When he turned to the third time and turned it up very instructively, he went, "Hari Baba, why are you messing?" It was like, I love that phrase. I always use it to this day when I do something with my kids. I go, "Hari Baba, why are you messing?" So he said that, and then he looked at Bhagavad, and at that time we had actually a gas top that had two gas burners, and then we had one coal bucket that we used for many other preparations, and basically for chapatis, because it would turn to ash and it would cook the chapatis perfectly. It's the right temperature. And then we'd put the chapatis on the coal. So this day, Prabhupada was sitting on the seat, and he looked at Bhagavad and he said, "I can make prasad for 145 minutes on these two burners." And Bhagavad looked at Prabhupada. They were always laughing and joking, and Bhagavad said, "Impossible." No, but first Bhagavad said, "Khichdi." And Prabhupada said, "No, full prasad." And Bhagavad said, "Impossible." And then this shows a little side of Prabhupada's humor. Prabhupada turned to him, because he was standing and Prabhupada was sitting. Prabhupada said, "I will bet you 1 lakh of rupees." And we were just like, if we had no idea, we just entered into. And then Bhagavad started to laugh, and he said, "Prabhupada, whatever I have, if I win or lose, you will take all my money anyway." And Prabhupada said, "Yes." And at that point, Prabhupada stood up, and he looked at Bhagavad and he said, "See, so simple, still they cannot do." So that was the lesson of Prabhupada in the kitchen and teaching us how to make this very complicated yet very simple sabji, but it had to be exactly to his requirement. Devotees often ask me, what was Prabhupada's favorite? What did Prabhupada like to eat? I mean, he definitely had his upbringing and his Bengali, background and taste, but Prabhupada liked whatever was made well. If something was made properly, and if something was not, he wouldn't touch it. I mean, here in Vrindavan, actually again with me in 77, when he was quite ill, he didn't have an appetite. And at that point, Prabhupada said he had no appetite, so he didn't require a cook. And so that fell to me, and that meant I had no service, so to speak. And I actually went into severe depression. And so much so that it was not even depression, I went into hysteria. It was hysteria, it wasn't depression. And I was inconsolable, and I was not able to be dealt with. I locked myself in the room. And at that time, Tamal Krishna Maharaj was his secretary, and Abhiram was his assistant secretary. And so Tamal Krishna was getting the word through Abhiram what my condition was, but nobody brought any bad news to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada really wasn't even coming out at that point, and he wasn't coming out, and he had lost so much weight, he was so thin. This was probably July of 77, and I literally, from that morning, and it was afternoon, I literally cried and cried and cried and prayed. And then I'd keep getting these messages. Tamal Krishna Maharaj said, you should go to Gita Nagari, worship Radha Damodar. And then I was like, no. And then I got another message, we'll talk to Prabhupada, we'll get a deity made, and you can worship a deity. I was causing disturbance for everybody, because I wouldn't accept that I couldn't be near Prabhupada. That was my only way of getting in the door. And if that was taken away, I didn't see any way forward. So after hours and hours of sitting there crying, remember Abhiram came up and he just looked at me and he said, I feel so sorry for you. I said, what can I do to help you? And I didn't say a word. But in my mind, I didn't say anything because I thought if I speak my mind, he'll think I'm a sahaja. But he said, what can I do? And in my mind, I just thought, end my life. And I thought this is it. So at that point, he left like, oh God. But I didn't say it, but I thought it. And so at that point, there was a turning point for me. I started realizing I'm in Vrindavan. This is the land of Radharani. Prabhupada said that Radharani is the queen of Vrindavan. She's the controller of Vrindavaneshwari. He said that Radharani is the most expert in everything. He said, Radharani pleases Krishna with her dancing. He said, but she controls Krishna by her cooking. And he said, he told this to Jamuna, and he said, Radharani is very expert, and she makes, this is a side note, he said that she makes something different for Krishna every single day, and this is going on eternally. Just imagine this concept. And every day she cooks for Krishna, and every day it's different. So at any rate, I started to meditate on Radharani, and I started to pray to Radharani in this pitiful condition. And I said, Queen of Vrindavan, please, I want to serve your greatest servant, Srila Prabhupada. I beg you to let me serve Srila Prabhupada. And I don't know, it was, this went on all afternoon. And I was praying like this. I took shelter of Radharani. I gave up the other mindset and the confusion and the, about me and what am I going to do. And so I just began to pray to Radharani as the controller here. And then there was a knock on the door, and it was a brahmachari, and I did not want to see anybody or talk to anyone. And I remember I had my sari all the way down to my face, over my face, because I looked like I'd been hit with a baseball bat or something, and I'd been crying all day. And he said, Tamal Krishna Maharaj wants to see you. And I was like, no, I'm not doing it. He said, no, you have to come. He says it's important, you have to come right away. I'm like, okay. So I had my sari all the way over, and I came down the stairs just peeping out, so I could not trip. I come into this room right here, pay my obeisances, and I still have my sari on. I'm thinking, I'm already have a mental block. I'm not listening to anything he's saying. I didn't want to hear another idea. And I'm revealing to you a little bit of my craziness here. So it's all okay. So he said, Prabhupada said he wants to test you. And I really didn't hear what he said, because I'd already put up this block. So Prabhupada said he wants to test you, and he wants you to make Singara and Kachori in 45 minutes. And all of a sudden I lifted my sari and I said, what did you say? He said, Prabhupada said he wants to test you. And then he started going on, and he said in 45 minutes. And I knew in my mind, I started thinking, oh God, 35 minutes for kachoris just to cook. I needed 35 minutes, and then Singara, and then this, and then this. And he started saying, this is the most important service in our movement right now, is to get Prabhupada to eat. Because the mood at that time was if Prabhupada ate, then he would stay with us, he would have strength. Prabhupada hadn't eaten anything in weeks, honestly. And so he started telling me how important it was, and that I needed to focus on this, and how important this was. And I just, again, you'll see how my foolishness. I just said, Maharaj, I don't have time for this right now. I gotta go. And so I got up and I ran to the Didi kitchen, because actually Bhakti Charu Maharaj was also here. He was serving Prabhupada. And so he was in that kitchen. So I went up to the Didi kitchen, and there was one, some of you may remember in Saffron, the brahmachari, old Bengali man, Bibhu Chaitanya. Bibhu Chaitanya was up there. He cooked for the Didis for, God knows, 40 years. He passed away a few years ago. No English, very kind, very gentle, very real Vaishnav. So, but I could speak kitchen language. And so he got the 2 coal buckets going, because you had to get them started. And the clock was ticking. Time was important here. And so I had 1 coal stove for the Singara. Singara is a Bengali name for samosas. And they're made in such a way, it's like a log. They're not made that triangle way. So I had 1 bucket stove here for the Singara, 1 bucket here for the kachoris. And so it was like a whirlwind, and, like what was it, those dancing dervish? I mean, it was all magic. It was just magic. And then Bhakti Charu came in, it was time. I had them done in the exact amount of time Prabhupada said. I was just shaking, and I gave them to Bhakti Charu. He took them down, came through the garden. And a few minutes later, he came up and he said, Prabhupada wants to know what's in them. So I told him what was in them, and then 5 minutes later he came back and he said, Prabhupada's calling for you. He wants to see you. So I come through the garden, come into his room. Hadn't seen him, I know, in 2 weeks, because he hadn't come out. And he didn't have a shirt on. He only had his top piece on and his sannyas dhoti. He had his knee up, and his arm was on his shoulder, and his elbow was on his knee, and so his shoulder was jutting out. He was skin and bones. It was shock when I saw him. And his voice was so soft. When he spoke to me, I couldn't hear him from there. I had to come. I was maybe this far from him just to hear his voice. And I leaned up into him. And as I was seeing how thin he was, and he had this, the tears started to fill in my eyes. And Prabhupada said, he said, I have not eaten anything solid for 2 weeks. And then the tears started to roll. He goes, but I'm eating your Singara. And the whole room just went, Jai Srila Prabhupada. Everybody started dancing and singing, because that was the mood. If we could get him to eat, then that means we could get him to stay. And when devotees would pray, Prabhupada said, you pray to Krishna and you say, my dear Lord Krishna, if you so desire, please cure Srila Prabhupada. So that was our mantra, that was our prayer. So at that point, he said, I'm eating your Singara. And he looked at me and he said, so you can cook. It was like I said, it was pure magic. It was interesting, though, a side note, when I got back to the States and I told Jamuna my story, she said that I actually made Prabhupada serve me. She said, because Prabhupada had no need for that service. In my intense desire and my intense prayer, he gave in just to make me happy. So I hadn't thought of it in that way, and so that was another vision. So then he looked at all the men in the. So then he looked at the men in the room, and there was about 6 men in the room, mostly sannyasis, and actually, who else was there? The servant was Upendra. Upendra was there. Harisari was no longer in the party. And he looked at all the men and he said, when she's in the kitchen, no one is to be there. And then he looked at me and he said, you must shop, you must cook, and you must clean. And you must have no assistance. He said it very firm. And then he looked at me and soft and he said, is that all right? I said, of course, Srila Prabhupada. And then I started to choke up and I said, Srila Prabhupada, I was praying to Radharani. He immediately cut me off and he said, yes, I know. So that was the end of that. And so I began, but the truth of it was Prabhupada truly had no appetite, and it became almost comical. I came to the story basically from telling you that he wouldn't eat something if it wasn't prepared properly. Remember I said that? That's how I got to that story. It's how my brain just circles. So Tamal Krishna Maharaj then started to tell me to make things that he was familiar with, make things that his mother would make things that Pishima would make things that Jamuna would make things to create an appetite, make things to make him eat, because he didn't want to eat. So that went on for a short period of time, and that proved futile. I could tell you what he ate every day on the palm of my hand. It was just a spoonful of this, and then when I would come in, it was, he would do it just out of his kindness. One day he told me to make idli, he told me to make Awara, and when I came in, he would take the spoon and he touched the back of the idli. He touched it with the back of the spoon and it didn't indent, it didn't go in. And he looked at me and went, he said, soft means soft as cotton. Hard means hard as a rock. It should be soft as cotton. He didn't even taste it. Didn't want anything to do with it. Then he went over to the Dayivara. He took the spoon and he pressed it. And it had some spring to it. So he took a bite. And that was about the gist of it. He truly had no appetite. But I was on the verge of suicide, honestly. So this is just another example how Prabhupada's kindness and prayer and desire, and how Prabhupada is accessible. And I implore you, I encourage you, I ask you to see Srila Prabhupada in your lives today as real and accessible. And if we see him in that way, I don't know if I said this before, but if we keep him, his instructions, his standards, his example in front of us and not behind us as a historical figure, but if we live that, if we imbibe that, he will be accessible to each and every one of us. And it is up to us. We can have his company or the shadow of his company, but it's there for all of us. These are not, as I said, these are not chosen few and people that were special. This is what what was given to me, that story is not about me. That story is about intense desire. That story is about the longing, the heartbreaking for service, the spiritual master. So, this is relevant for you. Prabhupada, he told Yamuna once in Calcutta, when she had cooked a meal, he was so pleased with the meal. Prabhupada had a system. Prabhupada had a wonderful sense of humor, but he had a system where if the meal was okay, it was considered third class, and he did this. If it was second class, he would do this. If it was first class, and if it was over the top, he would do this. So this one day that she cooked, he said, "Where did you learn to cook like this?" She said, "Srila Prabhupada, you taught me." He said, "No, I did not teach you this." He said, when I came to the West, I expected to eat boiled potatoes. He said, "I never imagined my disciples would learn to cook like this." And then he said, Are you teaching the others?" And a voice, this was in Calcutta, Koshaya, another god sister, was listening through the door. In those days, if you had access to Prabhupada, if you were in his service, you had free entry into his room, into his world, into his cooking kitchen. There were always guards at Prabhupada's door. And you couldn't get in, but Koshaya was in some personal service, so she was right there at access ear, listening. And so when Prabhupada said, "Are you teaching the others?" she went, "No, Srila Prabhupada, she's not teaching us." Okay, where'd that come from? And Prabhupada looked at her and he said, "If you have knowledge and you do not give it, then you simply become envious." So, again, that principle, what does that mean? If you have knowledge and if you don't give it, you become envious. You begin to think that it's you and that you're the doer, you did this, I created this. It's again, I, me, mine, but it's not, nothing in our philosophy is I, me, mine. And everything that we give, we're to give. Everything that we've been given, we give. So even though, it's been always hard for me to speak, mainly, I don't feel qualified. But the other thing, there's just too much emotion. It's generally hard. So so it's my duty to give. So I'm here with you tonight. My Dharmatma, who's completely persistent, doesn't give up, determined, and guilts me every time I come to give. So you may not know it, but it's difficult. So I'm hoping I can give you something that will, again, inspire you and take you deeper into your relationship with Prabhupada, because I truly had no qualification or ability except I had intense desire. And I wouldn't compromise that. Whether I was allowed, in those days, a lot of the sannyasi men, they didn't want the women around. And I grew up with 3 brothers, so I really didn't take offense, but I wasn't planning on allowing it. So I'd be met here with this, and I'd come around this way. I'd be met here, and I'd find another way to get in. And so that was just my personality, and that's one of the reasons I survived in this service. Not only because I tried to live Prabhupada's standard and imbibe what he wanted from us, but it was the intense desire to be near him. Okay, so how far did we get? We got time, we got waste. Oh, I didn't finish, there was another waste. me see if I can find that. Jamuna talked about, it was with some matches. You know how I don't know about today, but then the matches in India, I mean, you'd have to strike a whole box before you'd get one to light. I mean, are they still like that? Here she was saying, she was telling, when we were sharing these principles, she was sharing her story, a couple stories with waste. And she says one time she was with Prabhupada, and he wanted her to light, I guess, whatever, the stove. It was one match, two match, three, four. I mean, she went through a pile. Finally, he snatched it out of her hand. And I just want to read to you the way she's described it to me. She said, first she was saying how inferior and easily the matches, if they don't snap, then they don't ignite, or it goes out immediately. I mean, we've all experienced this. If you say they're still the same. So she struck one over and over. She says after the many, Prabhupada took it from her hand. She said, I recall his movement almost if it were in slow motion. With ease, he struck the match against the box, cupping his hands around the budding flame as if protecting it from Arctic winds. The flame leapt onto the first strike as he lowered it to light the stove. As I looked at him with puzzled awe, he spoke before I could open my mouth. He said, a devotee should become expert, know how to use things properly, and avoid waste. As I looked at my small pile of unlit matches resting on the stove, I see them again as I write. I realized how far I had to go in these areas, and I'm still working on them today. So, again, you know, the principle of waste. So where do we take that in our life? Is this wasting time, wasting energy? What biggest thing is we're wasting our life. You know, if we're not becoming serious, you know, we're going to waste this life. A story just came to my mind. I'm just going to share it with you. That there was one devotee in the early days who was thinking of leaving. She wanted to go back to her life. She had some theatrical pursuits and wanted to pursue it again. But Prabhupada was there. I'm not sure where they were, but she thought she'll wait till he comes out and pay her obeisances, and then she would leave. She didn't say a word to Prabhupada, but she had been struggling for a period of time that she needed to go back to her former life. He came out. She paid her obeisances. He was standing. He stopped at her. There were other devotees there. And as she was in her obeisances, he said to her, just give this one life. She came up and he said, what do you have to lose? He said, make an experiment. You'll get another birth. He said, just give this one life. And then he walked on. So of course she never left. And she's a very wonderful, very, very advanced devotee today. And actually she probably wouldn't mind me telling you, but it's Burijan's wife. So you see how far she's come. So that's also another example of not wasting this gift, this life that was given. Another thing on waste, it was also with Jamuna. Prabhupada was in the kitchen and there was rice on the floor. And she described, Prabhupada looked at it, and she said he looked at her with tears in his eyes. And he said, do not waste a grain of rice. He said, it is a gift. There's one grain. He said, do not waste a grain of rice. It is a gift. So again, these principles build and build on our consciousness. You know, time, purity, waste. So those are a few stories there. And then some more practical on quality and purity. Prabhupada had very, very refined taste. I mean, I don't have the words in my language to tell you how refined his tastes were. And in 1975, actually, Prabhupada came to Miami, and Sruti Kirti actually was the servant at that time. And I asked Sruti Kirti if I could make Prabhupada after his 4 o'clock. At 4 o'clock, Prabhupada took juice while he was traveling. Here in India, I would do the 4 o'clock, and Prabhupada I would make him fresh juice and also get a fresh garland, and then also I would put fresh chandan on his forehead. But at that time, I hadn't been in his service, and so I asked Sruti Kirti if I could make his juice. So it was January, February time. It was citrus time in Florida, and I also seek quality in everything. I mean, I can go into a store. You wouldn't want me, paying my bills. I would find the most expensive, the best quality of something amongst. It's just, I have attraction to it. It's just something by nature. So I always sought out the best quality of everything, and there was citrus season went on, from August, September through March. But January, February, there were these 2 types of oranges. One was called a Mineola, and one was also called Honeybell, and then there was a tangerine called Murcott in Florida. So I thought to combine these 2 of my favorites and offer these to Prabhupada. So I made it, and Sruti Kirti took it in, and immediately Sruti Kirti came out and said, Prabhupada wants to know about this juice. He immediately could taste the quality. He knew. There's so many stories like this, but one of my favorites is, again with Jamuna, here in Vrindavan. She was learning cooking and deity worship at Radharaman temple. At that time, Prabhupada had asked her. And so they would get this special wheat from Lahore, and they would grind it fresh for Radharaman. So they called it pishi. It was a pishi type of wheat, but it was from Lahore, so it was called pishi Lahore. And they cooked it for Radharaman on this stove that the flame was made out of wood. It was made out of neem wood and cow dung. So it gave a special flavor to this certain type. Prabhupada had come, and Jamuna was so eager to serve these to him. She didn't say a word. She went and had the flour ground fresh that day. I had it here where she talked about it. But at any rate, she gave Prabhupada the fulka chapati. He took one bite, and he looked at her and he said, "Oh, this is pishi Lahore." He said, and it is cooked on neem and cow dung. He said, only one thing, if you would cook it 1 or 2 seconds, he said 1 or 2 seconds longer on the tawa, it would be perfect. And he said, and it was ground fresh within the last 3 hours. He knew every single step on that chapati. He knew the name of the flour. He knew when it was ground. He knew it was cooked on. I mean, this were the senses that I'm talking about. So this also brought another dimension to consciousness and existence, to be in Prabhupada's presence. You could not be not without being conscious. You wouldn't last. You wouldn't be there. It was like you'd be kicked out, or you'd fall down, or Maya would come in, or something would happen. So this was great training. And that's what so it's not that it's just us, but this is also for you, and I hope I can give you that. So just the last thing on quality, Prabhupada had us grind everything. At that point, from 75 to 77, things changed. Jamuna called it, she compared Prabhupada's years here with Adi, Madhya, and Antya. And she described in the Adi years, we're talking about cooking, in early ISKCON, if I have it right, there was only red chilies. They called them sharks in those days. There was no hing. And I don't think there was mustard seeds. It was either mustard or cumin. I think it was only cumin. So they had turmeric, they had red chilies, and then they had Western spices. And so she called that the Adi years. And then, that was the development of garunga potatoes and, the sweet rice and the halvas and things, everything fried, and then sour cream, So that was all began in America. That wasn't. So then the madhya, she said that was like 66 to 70. So then in 70, when they came to India for the first time, hing was introduced, mustard was introduced, green chilies were introduced, so many other, and then preparations were introduced. So she called that from 70 to 75, and I came in 75, and that was a whole different way of cooking for Prabhupada. We weren't using any seeds at all. Everything had to be ground fresh because he wanted purity. And so the night before, I would soak cumin seeds in water, mustard seeds in water, black peppercorns in water, any dolls we would use for either, wadas, boras, dosas, whatever, buddies, they would be soaked. And then also fresh turmeric root would be soaked, but you have to soak that for like 4 or 5 days. So I would go in every single morning for an hour and a half before and grind. We had a stone, it's called a silbata. I actually still have Prabhupada's silbata. You may have seen it. It's a stone with holes in it, and you have a hand on it and you grind everything. And so for an hour and a half, I literally ground every single thing to a paste masala. And so then we would have all these bowls. So every dish, before you'd heat the ghee, you'd add these paste masalas. This not only added layer of flavor, but it was assured purity. We even ground our own salt. We had rock salt. We even ground our own sugar. We had rock candy, and we ground it to a powder. Because Prabhupada said everything in the market was cut. Nothing was pure. And he said even the sugar, they would cut it with bones, he said, to make it white. So we ground everything. So this was that period of time. Coming to a close here. So that's just a little bit on the purity, on the so I went quality, purity. I'm trying to step it up here. But I want to tell 2 last stories that are two of my favorite stories to give you another side of Prabhupada. I want you to not only see a slice in his day, but his mood and what he required. I mean, as I said, we all know him here by his books and by the grandfather guru, the great-grandfather guru, but he cared so much for his disciples. I mean, I walked in a room one time in Bhubaneswar because I was cooking on a wood stove, and so I kept a fresh sari and so before I would go in, and I'd cook, it was on wood, and so I'd be black. And in those days, I wore a lot of white with border. And for whatever reason, India just took more of a renounced way. And I walked in all fresh. I'd put fresh tilak on, fresh sari. I'd go in with a plate. As soon as I walked in the door, Prabhupada said, "Oh, you have new sari?" It was new. I just bought it the day before. And it was just, just the way he was. And I said, "Yes, Srila Prabhupada, I bought it yesterday in Puri," because we were in Bhubaneswar. I went into Puri. He said, "It is very nice." He said, "My mother used to dress like this." He said, "It was very nice. It was white with a red border." I got so pleased. I went and put it on the wall, went back to Puri and bought another one. And I still have that sari today, So there were just little things. I don't know, my mind got sidetracked why I even said that, but just how kind he was. Paligo, the opposite. She would wear her worst sari. It looked like a rag, street sweeper when she came in. And one day she came in here in Vrindavan, and he looked at her and he said, "You need new sari?" She said, No, Prabhupada, I have. And she had good saris. She said, No, Prabhupada, I have. And he said, "Your husband has taken sannyas." He said, "I will take care of you." He said, "I will buy you new sari." She said, no, Prabhupada, I have. Maybe it was because of that I always kept a fresh one in the, but it's kindness, I could just go, but I want to tell you a little bit about prasadam before we close. One of my favorite stories, and some of you have heard that because you've heard me speak, but it is something to be treasured. Mayapur, 1977, when I was cooking there, after Prabhupada would eat, we would put everything on one big plate and walk the main building. It was 3 floors then. Would walk the main, I think it was 3, walk the main and distribute. And so everyone knew at a certain time, Prabhupada's remnants would be coming out. So there were little groups every single day, 2 here, 3 here, 5 here, and chatting and waiting for the, so I would come with a plate and everybody was very, 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 very picky. I can't say very enough. No. And it became like, literally took me an hour. Took me 1 hour to distribute this. And this to me was a waste of my time. And it really annoyed me. And I know hate is a strong word, but I literally hated doing this every day. And I would just get more and more into this. So one day when I'm picking up Prabhupada's plate, and Prabhupada didn't eat and get up and leave. Prabhupada would sit there while you cleaned everything. And he'd either say something or he would just watch you. And he would usually sit, his knee would be up and he'd have a toothpick and he'd be picking his teeth. He'd be staring right through you, it felt like. And sometimes he would point to what you would miss. So that day he's sitting there and he's picking, and I'm picking up the plates and I'm wiping, and he's looking at me just in silence and watching every move. And he looks at me and he said, you should mix everything. He said, you take my remnants and you mix before you distribute. A light bulb went off in my head and I was like, major note. I mean, it was like, so I went downstairs and I must confess, I mean, it was evil. I mean, I put everything and I took the palm of my hand and I kneaded it. And it was a mass. It was like dough. It was a mass. And then I took the plate and I went, and everybody looked, and they were literally, the only thing I didn't, the shukta, the karela, the sweet rice, the sabjis, everything except the chilies. I always put 3 green chilies on Prabhupada's plate. He would eat, he would take chili. So I left the chilies out. I wasn't that bad. So I left those out. But I went, there they were in their little groups, everywhere. And to the shock of everyone, they were like, okay, got through. The next day, maybe half was there. Another day, 3rd, 4th day, no one, not a single person. I was zip, I was down in 5 minutes. I would go down, I'd eat the whole plate. And not only that, I tell you from the truest part, it was divine. And every day I knew they weren't there, I did the same mashing, and it was still this conglomerate of this mash. And zip, not a soul in sight, except the 3 chilies, and the Bengalis would take the chilies. They would take the chilies, and then I'd go back down, then I started to invite my friends, and then we would share this mass, and it was beautiful. It was divine. We loved it. So we got the mercy every day like that. So then after several days, and I'm coming up Prabhupada's room after, 5, 6, 7 days of this, Prabhupada was picking and watching what I'm doing, and he looked at me and he said, so, you were mixing? I was trying to hide my face, but I just said, oh, Srila Prabhupada, this is a very good system. And he just shook his head. And on a side note, which I did not know then, I didn't learn until came back, and after Prabhupada's departure, I learned that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had the same system. And before he started mixing, he would ask his cook, who took the sweet, who took the fried, who took the chewed and spit out. Because he would eat this, this vegetable datta posta, drumstick. So it's like chewing wood. It's literally straw. You get whatever little bit you can get off of it, and the next bit is straw sitting. It's hard. And he wanted to know who ate the datta, who went for the chewed. And he knew in his mind, the level of devotion where, it had nothing to do with me. I'm not saying me, because I have none. That was great fortune. But he wanted to know who each, so then he told his servant to mix. And so I was very happy to hear. And so Prabhupada obviously knew that system, or by his own spiritual, because I didn't tell him, Prabhupada, I hate this. This is really bad. But he would just, like I said, watch you. And then, as he was watching me day after day, he said, you should mix. So, again, I encourage you to take any of this, all of this, something of this that's touched you, inspired you, and make Srila Prabhupada relevant in your life today, and take these principles to deepen your own Krishna consciousness. And there's nothing sweeter to aspire for the Sangha, the lotus feet of our spiritual master. And I thank you all, and all glories to all of you. Hare Krishna.